Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at ETB trigger-related commanders, specifically Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, and Yarok the Desecrated. So Elesh Norn, 5 mana 4/7 with Vigilance. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. Meanwhile, Yarok is Death Touch and Lifelink, and if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So obviously there's some differences. There's different stats, different abilities. Death Touch and Lifelink on Yarok 3/5, Vigilance and 4/7 on Elesh Norn. Now, in terms of just the abilities, Elesh Norn is better because it has the stacks effect of shutting down opponents' permanents. But in terms of colors, Elesh Norn is very restrictive, being in mono white, whereas Yarok is in bug colors, so you get access not only to more colors, but just better colors and better cards. But you are still going to be doing basically the same type of strategy in both situations, which is that you're going to want a lot of cards that have double triggers, and of course you'll have combos that involve triggering things multiple times. So let's start with Elesh Norn first. So we've got our card draw. Here we're going to be a lot more restricted than what we could get in the bug colors. So we do have Esper Sentinel and Skull Clamp, and then after that we're kind of restricted. We've got the One Ring, Coveted Jewel. This is a 6 mana. Basically, it's a mono rock. ETB, draw 3, tap, add 3 mana of any color. Whenever one or more creatures an opponent controls attack you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel. Untap it. So presumably with Elesh Norn, you'll draw 6 immediately and then still have the colors, and then you'll have to find a way to make sure that you don't get attacked without being able to block them so that they can't steal the Coveted Jewel from you. We've got Rumor Gatherer, 3 mana 2/1. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. If this is the second time this ability is resolved this turn, draw a card instead. So again, with Elesh Norn out, it triggers twice, so it immediately draws a card. So it basically says anytime you cast your second creature, you scry and then draw a card. Spirited Companion is just draw a card. Mightstone Weakstone can enter and draw 2 or 4 cards with Elesh Norn. Also, it can then stick around as a pseudo mono rock that only taps for artifacts and abilities. Throne of Eldraine is a mono rock / card draw spell, and then we've got War Room. A little bit of fast mana in Jeweled Lotus and Lotus Petal to get Elesh Norn online faster. Pretty typical lands here with mostly snow-covered plains. The fact that they're plains, that the plains are snow-covered does matter for one card in the deck. And then aside from that, it's just pretty stock here. Ancient Den is in here basically just so that you have more artifacts for Mox Opal. Nykthos for white permanents, etc. This is pretty straightforward though. There also is a reason for fetch lands, which we'll get to later. Then we've got protection spells. We want to make sure that our Elesh Norn, 1, doesn't die, and 2, that we have the ability to potentially go off through counter spells and through removal spells. So we've got Giver and Mother of Runes to protect. We've got Ranger Captain and Silence as more protection, and Skrelv as well to add in as another Mother and Giver effect. Bunch of ramp spells. We do need to play a bunch of ramp, and we do need to get to Elesh Norn as fast as possible. So whole bunch of ramp along with the keys, Manifold Key, Sonic Screwdriver, Voltaic Key, which double up as ways to untap bigger mana value cards like Grim Monolith, Mana Vault, and of course they untap the One Ring to draw more cards. Smothering Tithe in this deck because we are limited on what we can play in mono white. Then we're going to have some removal spells. Anything that's a permanent that has an ETB trigger for removal is going to be better than the typical removal spell. So we do still have Swords to Plowshares because it is really good, and Stroke of Midnight. This is basically the new better version of the color shifted Beast Within. Then aside from that, we've got Cavalier of Dawn, ETB, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent, and its controller creates a 3/3 golem. Grasp of Fate, ETB, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls until Grasp leaves the battlefield, which if you have an Elesh Norn means you get to exile 2 permanents per opponent. Journey to Nowhere, Leonin Relic Order, On Thin Ice, this is the reason for the snow-covered plains in the deck. Skyclave Apparition, and Solitude. And then of course Mightstone Weakstone can also double as removal if you need it. Then of course we're in white, so we're going to want our stacks pieces. So we've got our Rule of Law effects, Archon of Emeria, Deafening Silence, Aethersworn Canonist, Phyrexian Censor. There are other Rule of Law effects like, Rule of Law that we could play, but this feels like enough. Drannith Magistrate, of course, Aven Mind Sensor to shut off searching, Rip for, rip stuff. We don't need our graveyard in this deck anyway. Then for sweepers, we've got Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite just as a big value card. Also Portal to Phyrexia. Portal also gets the double triggers off of the commander. Then a little bit of tutoring in Enlightened Tutor, Ranger, Captain, Recruiter, and Urza's Saga. And then Asera Ascendant is just a good beater. Just 1 mana for a 6/6 lifelink flyer is pretty good. Then over here, we've got our combo pieces, of course. Felidar Guardian, Helm of Obedience, Panharmonicon, and Rip. So Helm plus Rip is a combo right there. If you have Rip in play, Helm of Obedience can mill an opponent to death with 1 activation. Does kind of suck that it doesn't hit all opponents, but you can hit them 1 at a time or just take out the player who's about to combo, for example. Then Felidar Guardian and Panharmonicon are also going to be cards that are basically combo pieces where you can blink stuff around, get multiple things. You get even more triggers with Panharmonicon, with Elesh Norn. And then we've got our ETB trigger cards. So this is basically all the cards in the deck that have ETB triggers of some kind, of some variety. So apart from the ones that we've already gone through, there's Abdel Adrian. So if you're not familiar with the World Gorger Dragon loop, this is kind of the same type of card as World Gorger Dragon. When it enters the battlefield, you exile any number of other non-land permanents you control until it leaves the battlefield, and you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token for each permanent exiled this way. So if you have a Felidar Guardian, you can have the Felidar Guardian come in and blink the Abdel, and then the Abdel can come in and trigger, and you can like blink these back and forth. There are ways of blinking this back and forth in a way that can get you a whole bunch of soldiers, or just float mana from your mana rocks in between getting the trigger on Abdel. You have Eldrazi Displacer also as a way to just blink creatures around and get their triggers more and more. We've got Conjurer's Closet and Teleportation Circle as ways of triggering on the end step to get more triggers out of the things that we're blinking. Eerie Interlude and Ghostway as ways of blinking our entire board to get more triggers. There's Lazelle's Acrobatics. This is a 4-mana instant. Exile all non-token creatures you control and then roll a d20. So basically another copy of Eerie Interlude and Ghostway. And then you get additional abilities. So 1 through 9 is return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. And 10 through 20 is return them, but then exile them again and then return them again. So half the time it's just a 4-mana version of Eerie Interlude and Ghostway. And then the other half of the time it's a double Eerie Interlude or Ghostway. We've got Moonshaker Cavalry as our big endgame Craterhoof Behemoth type card, which can even be doubled up with Norn, of course. Amiria Shepherd is landfall. As long as the land is a plains, you can get to put a permanent back onto the battlefield. Otherwise, you just, or rather a non-land permanent back on the battlefield from the graveyard. Otherwise, it just goes to hand. But of course, we have mostly plains, and this is the primary reason for the fetch lands, because it gets to double trigger the Amiria Shepherd. Of course, on Thin Ice, we've been through a bunch of these cards already. Preston the Vanisher, 4 mana, 2/5. Whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't cast, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's an 0/1 white illusion. And most of the time, we don't care that it's a tiny creature, because we usually just care about the ETB triggers on all of these things. And of course, with Norn out, it gets double triggers. It also has 2 mana, sack 5 illusions, exile target non-land permanent. You're probably not going to do that very often, but it is worth noting. Then Resto Angel, of course, is another one. So one of the things here is that when you have Resto Angel and Felidar Guardian, you can blink these back and forth, popping them back and forth over and over and over. And notably with Abdel, that's how you get Abdel to go infinite. So if you've got Felidar plus Resto plus Abdel, it means that you can, let's say you have Abdel and Resto Angel in play, right? You go Felidar Guardian, you blink Resto plus Abdel. Abdel comes in, blinks everything, and then the Resto blinks the Abdel. You just flicker these back and forth over and over. You make infinite soldiers, you make infinite mana off your mana rocks, etc. We've got Semester's End. This is yet another version of the Ghostway, Eerie Interlude, Lazelle's Acrobatics cards. Exile any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers you control at the beginning of the next end step. Return each of them to battlefield under owner's control. Each of them enters with an additional +1 counter and an additional loyalty counter. So just another way to blink all of our stuff for value. And then 1 Wall of Omens here we left out earlier. Basically just another copy of Spirited Companion. So mostly what you're going to be doing with Elesh Norn is you're going to try to ramp into it as fast as possible, since most of the cards in the deck have ETB trigger related stuff. There's 29 cards in the decks with ETB triggers. You want to get that value out of the Norn as quickly as you can, and then you can eventually find a combo to put together, either Helm Rip or something that involves looping ETB triggers and exiling stuff with like Felidar, with Resto Angel, etc. And not just with Abdel, Felidar and Resto Angel can also go infinite with other things. So because you have both of these, and then also Norn in play, they get double triggers, meaning let's say you have Felidar plus Resto plus something else that has an ETB trigger. Let's just say Spirited Companion. So you go Felidar enters the battlefield, double trigger, you blink Spirited Companion, Resto Angel. Spirited Companion comes back, draw a card. Resto Angel comes back, double trigger, blink Felidar, blink Spirited Companion, draw your whole deck. So this applies to every single ETB card in the deck, as long as it's a creature, presumably. Although with Felidar, it can also blink any permanent, so anything that can happen. So like, if you've got that loop, Might Stone, Weak Stone is kill everything under your opponent's controls and draw your whole deck. Anything that's a draw spell or a draw trigger is draw your whole deck. Anything that's removal, like Cavalier, is destroy everything of your opponents. And that is primarily what you're going to be doing with Elesh Norn. Now, moving on to Yarok, of course, we've got a similar thing where we want to ramp into Yarok as fast as possible and play lots of cards that have ETB triggers. But of course, since we're in bug colors now, we've got access to more cards and we've got access to better cards and better combos. So in the card draw, we get access to a bunch of things that we wouldn't be able to do in Elesh Norn. So Citadel, Necro, Mystic Remora, Rhystic Study, etc. We get counter spells because we're in blue. We get better fast mana because we've got access to Dark Ritual, Elder Spirit Guide. Our lands are, of course, going to be more diverse for bug colors. We've got different kinds of protection. We're not running the Givers of Runes and the Mother of Runes, etc. This time we just got Veil of Summer. We have access to better ramp because we can play Monodorks and Carpet of Flowers. A little bit of reanimation, specifically the enchantment version, since we get double triggers on these. Kenrith's Transformation is a good removal spell because it triggers twice, so we get to draw 2 cards when we play it. Orcish Bowmasters, this one's not too relevant since it's mainly in here to stop draws, but it is relevant that we get double triggers off of it. Then of course Rift and Portal of Phyrexia. And then all the cards that have triggers and combo cards, which we'll get to in a bit. We, of course, get a bunch of tutors, which, and again, in this deck is going to be relevant, whereas in Elesh Norn, we only really have access to, like, Enlightened Tutor, and that's it. Here we get access to a lot more tutors. And then, so here's the ETB trigger cards. So the Animate Dead spells. We've got, of course, Cloud of Fairies, Peregrine Drake, Palancron to untap our lands. Deadeye Navigator as a combo piece, Displacer Kitten as a combo piece, Cloudstone Curio as a combo piece, E-Witness. We've got our clones in Flesh Duplicate and Phantasmal Image. Nissa Resurgent Animist gets more triggers from landfall, which means anytime we play a land, we always get the second trigger to go find another elf or elemental. Risen Reef, of course, fantastic in this deck. Yarok himself is also a elemental, and you get double triggers off of all elementals entering. Shrieking Drake, which ETBs, returns a creature to hand, so you get double triggers off of this, meaning you can bounce itself and something else. Same thing with Venser Shaper Savant, and same thing with Zephyr Sentinel. And then, of course, Panharmonicon to add more triggers. So these are all of our trigger cards, and specifically with the combos. So if you have Deadeye Navigator plus anything that untaps our lands, we get to generate infinite mana, because we can only spend 2 mana to blink the creature, and then we untap more than 2 lands with any of these cards. Palancron itself is a combo alone, because as long as you have enough mana to where you can generate at least 12 plus Yarok, you get to win the game. So if you have 6 lands or more, Palancron, you will have to have ways of generating mana in some way. But anyways, Palancron ETB trigger, you untap your lands. Then with the second trigger on the stack, you float all of the mana, then you untap your lands again, then you bounce Palancron back to your hand, you recast Palancron, go infinite there. We've also got Shrieking Drake with them is the same deal. Like, let's say you have Shrieking Drake plus Cloud of Fairies. If you've got Yarok in play, Shrieking Drake ETB trigger, you bounce Cloud, you bounce Shrieking Drake back to your hand, then you just replay Cloud of Fairies, double trigger, you get 4 mana off the Cloud of Fairies, replay Shrieking Drake, you generate infinite mana that way. Of course, we've got Oracle and Consult, because why not? Displacer Kitten is a card that's going to blink any of our non-land permanents, which is also a way to go infinite depending on what we have. Or it can just be a value card when you're casting non-creature spells to blink either our ETB creatures or just like our mana rocks so that we can add mana again with them. Venser can function in the same way. Let's say we've got Peregrine Drake plus Venser plus Yarok, right? So the Peregrine Drake generates 10 mana per ETB because of Yarok. So it costs 5, Venser costs 4, so we're netting 1 each time. So we go Venser, it ETBs, it bounces itself, it bounces Peregrine Drake, we make infinite mana that way. And then after that, we can use Venser to ETB, bounce itself, and then just bounce one of our opponent's permanents. Then Venser just comes in over and over and over, bounces our opponent's entire boards back to their hand, and then we win the game essentially that way. Cloudstone Curio also does a similar type of thing as Deadeye or Shrieking Drake, where one creature can come in and bounce another creature and bounce and then that creature can come back, bounce the other creature, etc. We don't even need Yarok in play for Cloudstone Courier to be a combo piece in that regard. And then Saw in Half and Ghostly Flicker will allow us to copy creatures or blink creatures, either way, with one of these cards to make more and more triggers. Not necessarily an outright combo unless we also add Archaeomancer or some similar effect to the deck, although you easily could, but these can also just be really solid value cards. And now I said you didn't need to add Archaeomancer, but that's actually not the case because you can just add in Eternal Witness. So Eternal Witness will do the same thing where, let's say you've got Ghostly Flicker plus Ewit or Saw in Half plus Ewit, right? So you like Saw in Half your Ewit, you get triggers off of the Ewit, the token copies of Ewit bring back Saw in Half, you do it again. So if you have, so this doesn't generate the infinite mana that you need, but if you already have infinite mana, then you can just use Ghostly Flicker / Saw in Half to cycle the Eternal Witness over and over and over, generating infinite triggers, which will give you either infinite Ewits / every other creature you have in play, or just any other trigger that you have. There's also another combo with Nissa plus Dryad Arbor, where if you've got Deadeye Navigator, let's say, and you've got Nissa. So Nissa adds a mana whenever a land enters the battlefield. So since Dryad Arbor is a land and a creature, if you soul bond it with Deadeye Navigator and then you have a Yarok in play, then you can blink your Dryad Arbor with the Deadeye Navigator and it will trigger Nissa to generate 2 mana. Now, of course, this is essentially break even, but it does generate infinite ETB triggers if that's relevant for any reason. And there's other combos not pictured here that you could add into the deck. Obviously, there's tons and tons of cards with ETB triggers that draw, bounce, add mana, etc. So you could add any of those into the deck if you wanted to. This is just the main combos that you're going to be doing here. So that is Yarok. Again, kind of doing the same thing as Elesh Norn, where we're wanting to double up on the ETB triggers, but since we're in different colors, obviously, we have a different configuration of what we can do. So that is Yarok and Elesh Norn.